Ireland's oldest stone monuments weren't built randomly, and they weren't built simply to bury the dead. So why do they align with solstices, equinoxes, mountains, and horizons with such precision? And how did farming communities without metal, writing, or wheels move stones, weighing over 100 tons across miles of land? Why do some monuments hide light deep inside sealed chambers, while others leave the dead exposed to sky and sea? And if these sites were all built by the same people, why do they speak such different architectural languages? What kind of knowledge was being shared, what was being remembered, and what has been lost between then and now? Newgrange Passage Tomb. The low winter light settles gently over the bend of the River Bóinne, as the grass-covered mound of Newgrange rises from the surrounding farmland, with a composure that suggests long familiarity with the passing of centuries. Its circular form, measuring roughly 85 metres across, and enclosing a stone-built passage and chamber that were already ancient when the first metal tools appeared in Ireland, constructed around 3200 BCE by a Neolithic farming community whose material traces elsewhere are modest, but whose architectural ambition here is unmistakable. For beneath the turf lies a carefully engineered structure built from an estimated 200,000 tons of stone, including massive curbstones hauled from distant riverbeds, slabs of greywacke and granite transported from the Wicklow Mountains and the Burren region, and a retaining wall of white quartz and dark granite cobbles that once formed a striking facade, not as a random accumulation, but as a deliberate visual boundary between interior and exterior, life and ritual, approach and threshold, and the passage itself, narrow and precisely aligned, extends inward for nearly 20 metres, its floor stones gently rising toward a cruciform chamber roofed with a corbelled vault that still remains watertight after more than 5 millennia, an achievement of dry stone engineering that depends on exact angles, balanced loads, and a deep understanding of stone behaviour under pressure, all accomplished without mortar, metal, or written plans, relying instead on transmitted knowledge and collective memory. What distinguishes Newgrange, even among Europe's passage tombs, is the small opening above the entrance, the so-called roof box, a subtle architectural feature that might be overlooked were it not for its singular effect. For a few days around the winter solstice, when the sun reaches its lowest arc in the sky, a narrow beam of light enters this opening and travels slowly along the passage floor, illuminating the chamber interior for approximately 17 minutes, touching the basin stone at the back before receding, an event that requires not only precise orientation, but also an understanding of solar movement over the year, suggesting careful long-term observation and an ability to translate cyclical celestial patterns into permanent stone form. This alignment is not approximate, but remarkably exact, refined through incremental adjustment during construction, implying that the builders tested and corrected their work, perhaps over multiple seasons, and that the solstice itself held significance beyond simple calendrical marking, coinciding with the darkest point of the year and the gradual return of longer days, a moment heavy with agricultural, symbolic, and cosmological meaning for communities dependent on seasonal rhythms. The stones that line the passage and chamber are engraved with abstract motifs, spirals, lozenges, chevrons, arcs, and concentric circles, pecked into the surface with stone tools, their meanings not explicitly recoverable, but their placement far from arbitrary, with the most complex carvings appearing at thresholds and key visual points, including the entrance curbstone, whose triple spiral motif has become emblematic of the site, suggesting an encoded system of symbols rather than casual decoration, possibly relating to movement, cycles, or transformation, themes reinforced by the experience of entering the mound itself, transitioning from daylight into darkness, and then, at a specific moment of the year, witnessing light return in a controlled and temporary way. Archaeological excavation has revealed cremated human remains placed within stone basins in the chamber, along with small artefacts such as pendants, beads and bone pins, indicating funerary or ancestral functions. Yet the limited number of burials compared to the scale of the monument suggests that Newgrange was not a communal cemetery in a straightforward sense, but a place reserved for select individuals or ritual acts, perhaps tied to lineage, status or cosmological roles. And its construction would have required coordinated labour over decades, implying social organisation capable of sustaining long-term projects and shared symbolic goals. What complicates interpretation is that Newgrange does not stand alone, but forms part of the larger Bóinne complex alongside Knowth and Douth, with their own passages and alignments, creating a ritual landscape integrated with the river's bend, a natural feature that may itself have been imbued with meaning. And the clustering of monuments suggests that the area functioned as a focal point for gatherings, ceremonies, and the reinforcement of shared narratives across generations. Despite decades of study, certain questions remain unresolved. How knowledge of solar alignment was first identified and maintained, whether the carvings correspond to astronomical counts or are purely symbolic. How labour was mobilised without clear evidence of hierarchy, and why such architectural intensity appears concentrated here while leaving little trace in domestic contexts, creating a contrast between monumental permanence and everyday impermanence. The careful preservation of the solstice alignment over thousands of years also raises questions about continuity of knowledge, whether later communities understood and maintained the original function, or simply inherited a structure whose meaning had already shifted as Newgrange was reused, altered, and mythologized in subsequent periods, eventually entering medieval Irish literature as the dwelling of the Tuatha De Danann and the home of the god Dagda, a layering of story atop stone that reflects an enduring sense that the mound was more than inert architecture. Today, standing outside the reconstructed facade with its debated interpretation, one is confronted not with an answer, but with a controlled experience shaped by Neolithic choices, where light, stone, time, and movement intersect in a way that remains intelligible without being fully explainable. And Newgrange persists less as a solved artefact than as a carefully calibrated encounter, designed by people whose technical skill is evident, whose symbolic system is largely lost, and whose awareness of cycles, solar, seasonal and generational, was embedded directly into the landscape, leaving behind a structure that continues to function exactly as intended, even as the full extent of what was intended remains just beyond reach. Poulnabrone Dolmen. Rising abruptly from the fractured limestone pavement of the Burren, Poulnabrone Dolmen stands in stark contrast to the low, earth-covered mounds of the Bóinne Valley, its form reduced to the bare essentials of megalithic construction, two slender portal stones lifting a massive capstone into the open air, exposed to wind, rain and shifting light in a landscape shaped as much by erosion as by human intervention, and dated to roughly 3,800 to 3,200 BCE, making it broadly contemporary with Newgrange, yet fundamentally different in expression, suggesting that shared knowledge did not require uniform design. The surrounding karst terrain, formed over hundreds of millions of years from compressed marine sediments, creates a surface of grikes and clints that drains water quickly and supports thin soils, an environment that appears inhospitable at first glance, but was once more wooded and grazed by early farming communities who cleared patches of land for cultivation and burial, choosing this elevated position not for concealment but for visibility, as Poulnabrone commands wide views across the Burren Plateau, its silhouette recognisable from a distance and oriented roughly north-south, though without the precise solar alignment seen at Newgrange. Excavations carried out in the late 1980s revealed a complex burial history beneath the monument, uncovering the remains of at least 33 individuals, including adults, children and infants, interred over several centuries. along with grave goods such as pottery shards, stone axes, bone pins and beads, indicating repeated use rather than a single funerary event, and suggesting that the dolmen functioned as a communal tomb tied to a local group rather than an elite few. The skeletal evidence points to lives marked by physical labour, occasional trauma and periods of nutritional stress, yet also to careful ritual treatment in death, with remains often disarticulated, rearranged or cremated before placement, implying that burial was a process rather than a moment, possibly involving excarnation or temporary exposure elsewhere before final deposition beneath the stones. Structurally, the dolmen's apparent simplicity conceals a nuanced understanding of balance and load distribution, as the capstan, weighing several tons, rests securely on minimal contact points, its weight transferred vertically through the uprights into the bedrock below, a solution that required both careful selection of stone and an intuitive grasp of stability, achieved without formal measurement systems, but refined through experience and experimentation. Unlike Newgrange, Poulnabrone bears no carved ornamentation, no enclosed passage, and no evidence of celestial alignment. Yet this absence does not imply a lack of symbolic intent. Rather, it suggests a different emphasis, one that foregrounds the act of placement within the landscape itself, where the monument's exposure allows the dead to remain visibly present among the living, integrated into daily movement across the plateau and into seasonal cycles of grazing and travel. The Burren's geology adds another layer of interpretation, as the dolmen stones are composed of local limestone, drawn directly from the surrounding pavement, blurring the distinction between monument and terrain, and making the structure appear as though it has emerged naturally from the ground, a quality that may have reinforced ideas of ancestry rooted in place, where the dead were returned not into an enclosed chamber, but into the open structure of the land itself. Yet, questions persist about why such a prominent tomb was established in a region with relatively sparse evidence of large settlements, raising the possibility that Poulnabrone marked a territorial boundary, a seasonal gathering point, or a routeway across the Burren, serving social functions beyond burial alone. The contrast with Newgrange becomes instructive rather than contradictory, revealing that Neolithic Ireland was not governed by a single architectural language or belief system, but by a shared capacity to work stone at scale, adapted to local environments and cultural priorities. And while Newgrange orchestrates light and darkness within a sealed interior, Poulnabrone stages permanence against exposure, allowing time and weather to participate in the monument's meaning. Its continued survival, despite centuries of agricultural activity and stone removal elsewhere, suggests that later communities recognised its significance, even if its original context had faded, preserving it as a landmark whose purpose was no longer fully understood, but whose presence remained unquestioned. In this way, Poulnabrone does not resolve the mysteries introduced by Newgrange, but reframes them, demonstrating that whatever knowledge Neolithic builders possessed was flexible rather than formulaic, capable of producing monuments that differ radically in form, yet converge in their ability to endure, to anchor memory in stone, and to suggest that the relationship between the living, the dead, and the landscape was negotiated through careful placement rather than through uniform design, leaving behind a structure that stands exposed and undecorated, yet no less deliberate, inviting interpretation without prescribing it. Knoth. Set slightly apart, yet inseparable from the wider complex at Bóinne, Knoth occupies a commanding position on a low ridge overlooking the river Bóinne, its great mound broader than that of Newgrange, and encircled by the largest collection of megalithic art in Western Europe, more than 200 decorated stones, whose density and variety immediately suggest that this was a place where visual language carried particular weight, constructed around 3200 BCE, and sharing the same Neolithic origins as its more famous neighbour, yet expressing those origins through a different architectural logic that complicates any assumption of a single unifying purpose. The mound itself measures nearly 100 metres in diameter and contains two long passages placed on opposite sides, one facing roughly east and the other west, extending inward to separate chambers that do not meet. An arrangement that appears symmetrical at first glance, but resists easy interpretation, especially since neither passage aligns cleanly with the winter solstice sunrise or sunset in the way Newgrange does, though the western passage does capture the equinox sunsets in a more diffuse manner, allowing light to reach the chamber floor at certain times of year without the same precision, raising the possibility that Knowth was concerned less with singular moments than with balance, transition, or cyclical movement between light and dark. The curbstones that ring the base of the mound form an almost continuous gallery of carved imagery, with spirals, serpentine lines, zigzags, and nested lozenges flowing across stone surfaces in patterns that appear both repetitive and endlessly varied, sometimes wrapping around edges, sometimes abruptly terminating, and often interacting with the natural contours and fissures of the rock, suggesting that the carvings were designed in dialogue with the stone itself rather than imposed upon it, and that their placement at ground level ensured they would be encountered repeatedly by those moving around the mound, reinforcing their visibility and perhaps their mnemonic function. Unlike the interior carvings at Newgrange, many of Knowth's motifs are external, exposed to weathering and erosion, implying that their meaning did not depend on permanence of detail, but on form, movement, and repetition, and that they were intended to be seen in changing light conditions across seasons and times of day. Excavation has revealed evidence of complex activity around the mound, including hearths, pits, and deposits that suggest repeated gatherings, while the chambers themselves contained limited human remains, again pointing toward selective burial or ritual use rather than communal interment, and reinforcing the impression that Knowth functioned as a node of social and symbolic activity rather than a simple tomb. The engineering of the mound mirrors that of Newgrange in its use of corbelled roofing and carefully graded layers of stone and earth. Yet subtle differences in construction hint at independent planning decisions, perhaps even different building groups working within a shared tradition but pursuing distinct goals. After its Neolithic use, Knowth did not fade into obscurity but was repeatedly reoccupied and reinterpreted, becoming a fortified settlement in the early medieval period, with souterrains dug into the mound and defensive structures erected around it, a transformation that physically altered the monument while preserving its central prominence in the landscape, and illustrating how later communities adapted ancient structures to new needs without fully erasing their symbolic weight. This long sequence of reuse complicates efforts to isolate an original meaning, as layers of habitation blur the boundary between ritual, monument, and lived space. Yet they also testify to the enduring utility of the mound's location, scale, and construction. The sheer volume of decorated stones raises further questions about the role of art within Neolithic society, particularly given the absence of clear figurative imagery, suggesting that abstraction itself carried communicative power, perhaps encoding cosmological ideas, territorial markers, or social memory in a form that resisted fixed interpretation and could be reactivated through repeated viewing and movement. In contrast to Poulnabrone's stark exposure and Newgrange's controlled interior drama, Knowth presents a more outward-facing complexity where meaning seems to circulate around the monument rather than culminate at a single point, and where the act of walking the perimeter, passing stone after stone, may have been as significant as entering the chambers themselves. The relationship between the two passages, one oriented toward the rising light and the other toward its decline, introduces a quiet tension that has not been fully resolved by archaeological explanation, leaving open the possibility that Knowth was concerned with dualities, east and west, beginning and ending, visibility and obscurity, without committing to a single calendrical event. In this way, Knowth deepens the mystery established by Newgrange, rather than clarifying it, demonstrating that even within a tightly clustered ritual landscape, Neolithic builders experimented with form, orientation, and symbolic emphasis, producing monuments that share materials and techniques yet diverge in intention, and leaving behind a mound whose carved stones continue to suggest an ordered system of thought, even as the logic that once unified them remains only partially legible. Carrowmore Megalithic Cemetery. Spread across a gently undulating limestone plain near the coast of County Sligo, the Carrowmore Megalithic Cemetery presents a markedly different expression of Neolithic monumentality, not as a single dominant structure, but as a dispersed constellation of stone circles, cairns and dolmens, once numbering over 60 and originally constructed around 3,700 to 3,200 BCE. Making Carrowmore one of the earliest and most extensive megalithic cemeteries in Ireland, and one whose scale emerges not from individual mass, but from cumulative presence across the landscape. The monuments are generally modest in size compared to the great mounds of the Bóinne Valley, consisting of small stone circles enclosing central dolmens or cairns, many built with locally sourced limestone and sandstone, and often oriented toward the northeast, facing the rising sun and, in some cases, the prominent profile of Knocknarea mountain, whose massive cairn dominates the horizon and appears to function as both a visual anchor and a symbolic focal point for the entire complex. This repeated orientation suggests a shared spatial logic that linked individual tombs to a larger topographical framework, integrating distant landmarks into the ritual geography and reinforcing a sense of coherence across the cemetery despite its dispersed layout. Excavation has shown that Carrowmore's monuments were used primarily for cremation burials, with burnt human remains placed in simple stone cists or directly beneath capstans, often accompanied by minimal grave goods such as quartz fragments, stone tools or pottery. And the relative simplicity of these deposits contrasts with the labour-intensive construction of the stone settings themselves, implying that the act of building and positioning the monument carried as much significance as the materials placed within it. Unlike later passage tomb cemeteries, Carrowmore lacks long enclosed corridors and complex internal chambers, favouring open structures that maintain a visual relationship with the surrounding land, allowing the dead to remain symbolically connected to sky, horizon, and mountain, rather than enclosed within earth. The cemetery's development over time suggests incremental growth rather than a single coordinated project, with monuments added and modified across generations, creating a layered landscape of memory in which earlier tombs remained visible and influential as new ones were constructed nearby. This accumulation would have reinforced ancestral continuity, while also marking social presence across territory, especially given Carrowmore's proximity to the coast and to natural routeways linking inland and maritime zones. The choice of location, with broad views across Sligo Bay and the Ox Mountains, situates the cemetery at a threshold between land and sea, a liminal setting that may have carried symbolic resonance for communities engaged in both farming and coastal resource use. Yet Carrowmore's history is also marked by loss, as many monuments were damaged or dismantled in the 19th century for agricultural improvement, leaving gaps that complicate efforts to reconstruct the original layout and relationships, and reminding modern observers that the present landscape is a fragmentary remnant rather than a complete record. Despite this, enough remains to reveal a deliberate patterning that distinguishes Carrowmore from both the concentrated monumentality of Poulnabrone and the isolated prominence of sites like Poulnabrone, emphasising instead a collective approach to burial and commemoration, where no single tomb overwhelms the others, and meaning emerges through repetition and distribution. The absence of elaborate megalithic art at Carrowmore further differentiates it, suggesting that symbolic communication here relied more on placement, orientation, and cumulative scale than on carved imagery, and that the landscape itself functioned as the primary medium through which ideas were expressed. Archaeological interpretation continues to grapple with whether Carrowmore represents an early developmental phase of Irish megalithic tradition, or a parallel expression that persisted alongside later, more elaborate forms, and the evidence supports elements of both, indicating continuity without linear progression. In this context, Carrowmore complicates any narrative of increasing complexity, showing instead that simplicity and dispersion could coexist with architectural skill and symbolic depth. Seen together, the monuments form a quiet but insistent presence, one that does not direct attention inward to a single chamber or moment, but outward across a shared terrain, binding individual burials into a wider ancestral field, and suggesting that the knowledge held by Neolithic builders included not only how to raise stones, but how to distribute meaning across space, creating a cemetery that functions as a landscape of relationships rather than a collection of isolated structures, and whose full design only becomes apparent when viewed as a whole rather than in parts. Drombeg Stone Circle. Closer to the Atlantic edge, and far removed from the great burial landscapes of the eastern north, the Drombeg Stone Circle occupies a low rise overlooking the sea near the rugged coastline of West Cork, its 17 surviving stones forming a compact ring that appears modest in scale yet precise in execution, dated to the late Bronze Age around 1100 to 800 BCE, and marking a chronological shift that nonetheless preserves a continuity of concern with orientation, landscape, and cyclical time. The stones vary in height, but are deliberately graded, with the tallest portal stones positioned in the southwest quadrant, creating a focal axis that aligns with the setting sun at the winter solstice, an alignment confirmed through repeated observation and supported by the placement of a recumbent axial stone opposite the portals, a configuration that echoes stone circles in Scotland and suggests shared or transmitted ideas across the Irish Sea long after the construction of Neolithic passage tombs had ceased. From the circle, the sun sinks into the Atlantic horizon at the year's darkest point, its path framed by the stones and reflected in the nearby sea, binding sky, water and stone into a single visual event that would have required careful sighting and adjustment, even within a tradition that no longer favoured monumental mounds or enclosed chambers. Excavation around Drombeg has revealed evidence of associated activity beyond the circle itself, including the remains of a nearby Fulacht Fiad, a Bronze Age cooking site characterised by burnt stone and water-filled troughs, and traces of huts or enclosures, indicating that the circle was part of a lived landscape rather than an isolated ritual marker, and that gatherings at the solstice may have coincided with seasonal feasting, communal labour, or social reaffirmation. Unlike the burial-focused monuments of earlier periods, no human remains were found directly within the circle, suggesting a shift away from funerary emphasis toward ceremonial observation and collective participation, where the monument structured experience rather than housing the dead. The stones themselves are undecorated, their power derived not from carving but from arrangement and setting, and their weathered surfaces bear the marks of centuries of exposure, reinforcing the sense that endurance rather than enclosure was the desired quality. The circle's relationship to its surroundings is unusually open, with expansive views toward the sea and inland hills, and this openness contrasts sharply with the inward-facing design of sites like Newgrange, indicating a reorientation of ritual focus from interior revelation to shared external spectacle. Yet the underlying knowledge required to establish a solstitial alignment remains consistent, implying that observational traditions persisted across millennia even as architectural forms evolved. Drombeg's relatively small size suggests that Bronze Age communities no longer mobilised labour on the scale of earlier monument builders, but the precision of its alignment indicates that what was lost in mass was not lost in intent, and that careful planning continued to govern the placement of stone in relation to sky. The survival of the circle, despite later agricultural use of the land, points to a lingering respect for its presence, and while its original name and function are unrecorded, its modern designation as the Druids' altar reflects later attempts to interpret a structure whose meaning had already slipped beyond cultural memory. In the broader sequence of Irish stone monuments, Drombeg introduces a subtle but significant transition, showing that the knowledge encoded at earlier sites did not disappear but was adapted, simplified, and recontextualized, producing monuments that still engage with celestial cycles, but do so through communal visibility rather than hidden chambers, and reinforcing the impression that the builders across different ages shared an enduring attentiveness to time, horizon, and place, even as their social structures and ritual priorities shifted in ways that remain only partially visible in stone. Loughcrew Cairns. High on the windswept summits of the Sly of Knocnarea Hills in County Meath, the Loughcrew Cairns occupy a setting unlike any of the monuments that precede them. Their stone chambers and curbed mounds, clustered along narrow ridgelines where sky and land meet with little mediation, constructed around 3300 BCE, and thus broadly contemporary with the great passage tombs of the Bóinne, yet distinguished by their elevation and by an intensity of carved imagery that rivals and in some cases exceeds that of Knowth. From these heights, views extend across vast stretches of the Irish Midlands, and the choice to build here appears deliberately demanding, requiring the transport of heavy stones uphill to exposed locations where weather is severe and access is limited, a decision that suggests symbolic priorities strong enough to outweigh practical convenience. The cairns, numbering over 30, vary in size and complexity, with Cairnbane East, often referred to as Hag's Cairn, standing as the most prominent, its narrow passage leading to a cruciform chamber whose backstone is densely incised with spirals, concentric circles, rosettes, chevrons, and radial motifs arranged with a compositional balance that implies structured intent rather than spontaneous decoration. On the mornings of the spring and autumn equinoxes, sunlight enters the passage of Cairnbane East and strikes this carved backstone directly, illuminating the patterns in a brief but vivid display that echoes the solstitial drama of Newgrange, while shifting the calendrical focus toward moments of balance rather than extremes, and reinforcing the impression that different communities within the Neolithic world emphasize different points within the annual cycle. The precision of this alignment, achieved at such elevation, would have required careful observation of the horizon and repeated calibration, and the fleeting nature of the illumination suggests that the event itself, rather than prolonged visibility, was the central concern, an occurrence that could only be witnessed by those present at the correct moment and place. The carvings at Loughcrew are notable not only for their density, but for their apparent variation from stone to stone, with some surfaces heavily worked and others left plain, raising questions about whether different motifs corresponded to different phases of use, symbolic categories, or participants, and whether the act of carving itself formed part of the ritual sequence associated with burial or commemoration. Excavation has revealed cremated human remains and simple artefacts within some chambers, but as elsewhere, the scale of the monument far exceeds the volume of burial evidence, suggesting that the cairns functioned as focal points for gatherings that extended beyond funerary rites. Folklore attached to the hills preserves later interpretations, casting the cairns as the seats or graves of supernatural figures, a narrative overlay that, while historically distant from their origins, underscores the enduring perception of these summits as places set apart. The relationship between Loughcrew and other passage tomb complexes remains a subject of debate, particularly whether knowledge of equinox alignment and carved symbolism developed independently here or was shared across regions through networks of interaction. But the similarities in construction technique and iconography argue for a connected tradition capable of regional variation. In contrast to the lowland monumentality of Poulnabrone, Loughcrew's cairns emphasise exposure and ascent, requiring effort to reach and offering little shelter once there. And this physical challenge may have been integral to their meaning, marking participation as an act of commitment and transition. The hills themselves, rising sharply from the surrounding plains, become part of the architecture, extending the monument beyond stone walls into the broader topography and making it difficult to separate built form from natural setting. In this way, Loughcrew reinforces a recurring pattern across Ireland's prehistoric monuments, where knowledge of stone, sky and land converges in site-specific ways, producing structures that adhere to shared principles yet articulate them through different spatial experiences, and leaving behind cairns that continue to reward observation while withholding final explanation. Their carvings illuminated only briefly, their alignments precise but understated, and their purpose implied through repetition rather than declaration. Knocknarea Cairn. West of the Loughcrew Hills and closer to the Atlantic margin, Knocknarea rises sharply from the coastal plain of County Sligo, its limestone bulk crowned by an immense stone cairn that dominates the surrounding landscape, with an authority that is immediately apparent even at great distance, known today as Miosgan Meadba, and traditionally associated with Queen Maeve, though archaeologically dated to around 3200 BCE and firmly rooted in the same Neolithic passage tomb tradition as Newgrange and Loughcrew, yet distinguished by scale and placement rather than interior complexity. The cairn measures approximately 55 metres in diameter and rises to a height of nearly 10 metres, composed of an estimated 40,000 tonnes of stone gathered from the mountain itself and laboriously piled atop the summit, creating a monument that appears less like an addition to the hill than a deliberate amplification of it, extending the natural prominence upward and reinforcing its visibility from across Sligo Bay, the Ox Mountains, and the Carrowmore cemetery below. Unlike many passage tombs, Knocknarea's internal structure remains largely unexcavated, partly due to concerns about stability and preservation, leaving uncertainty as to whether a chamber exists at all or whether the cairn represents a solid mound. And this absence of confirmed interior space complicates interpretation, shifting emphasis away from hidden alignments or enclosed ritual moments toward the act of construction itself as the primary expression of meaning. The mountain's summit offers expansive views in all directions, and its cairn sits slightly offset from the highest point, suggesting careful consideration of sightlines rather than a simple pursuit of elevation, and reinforcing the impression that the builders were shaping how the monument would be seen rather than how it would be entered. Its relationship with Carrowmore below is particularly striking, as many of the smaller monuments in the cemetery appear oriented toward Knocknarea, creating a visual hierarchy in which the great cairn functions as a central reference point, binding dispersed tombs into a coherent ritual landscape and implying coordinated planning across generations. The tradition linking the cairn to Queen Maeve, who is said to be buried upright and facing her enemies, reflects a later attempt to account for a structure whose original purpose had long since faded from collective memory. Yet the persistence of this association underscores how power, sovereignty, and ancestral authority became attached to the site in later imagination, perhaps echoing earlier symbolic roles that cannot now be fully recovered. The sheer volume of stone required to build the cairn suggests sustained communal effort, Yet the lack of associated settlement evidence nearby raises familiar questions about how such labour was organised and supported, and whether participation in construction itself served as a form of social cohesion or ritual obligation. In contrast to the intricately carved chambers of Loughcrew or the precisely aligned passages of the Bóinne, Knocknarea communicates through mass and position alone, offering no visible ornamentation and no controlled interaction with light, and instead asserting permanence through scale, endurance and dominance of the skyline. This choice suggests that Neolithic monument builders understood multiple ways to encode meaning in stone, and that subtlety and precision were not always required to achieve lasting impact. The Cairns' continued prominence, despite centuries of stone removal from its lower slopes and agricultural activity around its base, attests to a long-standing reluctance to disturb its summit, indicating that even as its original context dissolved, the monument retained a sense of untouchability. Seen within the broader sequence of Irish stone monuments, Knocknarea represents an extreme expression of visibility and territorial marking, one that complements rather than contradicts the enclosed, experiential focus of other passage tombs, and reinforces the impression that the builders were not working toward a single architectural solution, but were instead exploring a range of forms through which memory, authority, and relationship to land could be made enduring, leaving behind a cairn that reveals little through excavation, yet communicates powerfully through presence alone. Brownshill Dolmen. South of the Bóinne Valley, and far from the clustered ritual landscapes of Meath and Sligo, the Brownshill Dolmen stands in relative isolation on gently rolling farmland near Carlow. Its significance conveyed not through setting or alignment, but through sheer physical improbability, as a vast granite capstone, estimated to weigh between 100 and 150 tons, rests improbably atop a ring of smaller supporting stones, making it the largest known capstone of any dolmen in Europe, and one of the heaviest stones ever deliberately raised by prehistoric people. Dated to the Neolithic period around 4000 to 3500 BCE, Brownshill belongs to the same broad tradition as Poulnabrone, yet it pushes that tradition to an extreme, transforming the portal tomb from a modest burial structure into an unmistakable statement of technical confidence. The supporting orthostats, relatively slight in comparison to the capstone, form a shallow chamber that may once have been covered by an earthen mound, now long eroded or removed, but even allowing for such a covering, the capstone's mass would have remained central to the monument's identity, visible or at least strongly implied, suggesting that its placement was the primary objective rather than a byproduct of enclosure. No comprehensive excavation has been undertaken beneath the dolmen, leaving uncertainty about the extent of burial activity associated with it. Yet parallels elsewhere indicate that any human remains would likely have been limited in number, reinforcing the familiar pattern in which labour investment far exceeds funerary necessity. The technical challenge posed by Brownshill is difficult to overstate, as the granite was not sourced locally but transported several kilometres from the foothills of the Blackstairs Mountains, requiring not only coordinated labour but also careful planning to avoid fracture during movement and lifting. And while theories range from earthen ramps and rollers to incremental levering, no single explanation fully accounts for the precision with which the capstone was finally settled into place. What is clear is that the builders understood the stone's tolerances intimately, selecting support points that could bear its weight and arranging them to distribute stress evenly, an achievement rooted in experiential knowledge rather than formal calculation. Unlike passage tombs, Brownshill shows no evidence of astronomical alignment, carved art, or repeated ritual modification, and its meaning appears instead to have been concentrated in the act of construction itself, transforming raw material into an enduring imbalance that still commands attention thousands of years later. The dolmen's survival largely intact despite its exposed position and agricultural use of the surrounding land, suggests a long-standing reluctance to interfere with a structure whose presence feels definitive, as though the effort required to dismantle it would rival that of its creation. In the broader arc of Ireland's stone monuments, Brownshill brings the sequence to a quiet but forceful conclusion, demonstrating that the knowledge held by Neolithic builders was not limited to symbolic alignment or landscape integration, but extended to an intuitive mastery of weight, friction, and force, allowing them to attempt feats that appear excessive even by modern standards. Set beside the calibrated light of Newgrange, the open exposure of Poulnabrone, the patterned complexity of Knowth, the dispersed order of Carrowmore, the solstitial framing of Drombeg, the elevated symbolism of Loughcrew, and the monumental mass of Knocknarea, Brownshill distills the tradition to its most elemental question. Not what the stones signify, but how they were persuaded to obey, leaving behind a structure that offers no inscription, no interior drama, and no clear ritual choreography, yet stands as undeniable evidence that those who built Ireland's earliest monuments possessed a practical understanding of stone and collective effort that remains difficult to replicate, and whose full implications, like the capstone itself, continue to rest heavily on the present without fully yielding their explanation.